In 1945, France returns to its colony of Indochina to bring it back into the fold of the French Empire. But the Vietnamese communist revolutionaries of Ho Chi Minh are there to meet them with cries for independence. Soon the mountains, rivers, and jungles of Vietnam will play host to a new war, the end of which will mean disaster for France and 20 more years of struggle for Vietnam against a new, even more powerful enemy. French involvement in Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, starts in the mid-19th century at the height of European imperial conquest. France wants to deny Britain further imperial possessions in Southeast Asia, so it spreads its influence across the previously independent kingdoms in Indochina via economic concessions, missionaries, armed expansion, and imposing protectorates. In 1887, it combines these protectorates into a single Indo-Chinese colony subject to France's so-called civilizing mission. In reality, this is a cover for colonial exploitation, impoverishment, and the suppression of local identities. French administrators want to bind their colonies closer to France, so they open French schools and spread the concepts of European science and ethics. These find fertile ground among young Vietnamese who've seen their traditional Confucian government system delegitimized by a seemingly superior European one. However, some also use them as the basis for Vietnamese nationalism. One such person is Nguyen Sinh Khun, later better known as Ho Chi Minh. Ho came from the countryside but received a French education in the old imperial capital of Hue. Although he gains a respect for French Enlightenment, he dislikes French colonial officials and local Confucian administrators. Having spent many years abroad, including in the US and Britain, in 1919 Ho Chi Minh is the head of a Vietnamese delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. Inspired by US President Woodrow Wilson's ideas of national self-determination, Ho calls for reform, but not immediate independence, for Vietnam. The great powers ignore his calls, since Wilson's ideas will not apply to colonized non-Europeans. Disappointed by the apparent hypocrisy of Western Enlightenment, Ho finds a more supportive ideology in communism, especially Leninism. In 1920, he helps form the French Communist Party, although again, he comes away disappointed. French communists still think that a colony is nothing but a country with plenty of sand underfoot and a sun overhead, a few green coconut palms and colored folk, and that's all. And they take not the slightest interest in the matter. Instead, Ho gains more receptive allies in the Soviet and Chinese Communist parties and familiarizes himself with Mao Zedong's revolutionary warfare theories. The relationship will not always be a smooth one. Ho's belief that the Vietnamese peasantry can conduct a revolution is at odds with some Soviet ideologues who favor an urban proletariat-led revolution. When Ho founds the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in 1930, this debate remains and limits the party's expansion. However, the party does attract new talent, including teacher-turned-self-taught military strategist Pho Nguyen Gia. The outbreak of war in 1939 and the fall of France in summer 1940 will also provide fresh opportunities. In 1940, the French colony of Indochina, today's Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, is on the front line in both the Second Sino-Japanese and the Second World War. In September, Japanese forces occupy northern Vietnam to cut off their Chinese enemies from Allied supplies via the Yunnan-Haiphong Railway. Japan also forces the Vichy French authorities governing Indochina to provide economic and transit rights in exchange for France keeping nominal control. In 1941, though, Japan occupies the entire colony. Now Vietnamese nationalist Ho Chi Minh returns to Vietnam after 3 decades abroad. He softens his Marxist-Leninist ideology in favor of a broader independence movement. In 1941, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party is absorbed into the larger League for the Independence of Vietnam, or Viet Minh. Its goal is to get all parts of Vietnamese society to resist the Japanese occupation and French colonialism. Rich people, soldiers, workers, peasants, intellectuals, employees, traders, youth, and women who warmly love your country. As one in mind and strength, we shall overthrow the Japanese and French and their jackals in order to save people from the situation between boiling water and burning heat. The Viet Minh conduct a limited guerrilla campaign against the Japanese, but they lack experience. When the US joins the war in 1941, Ho Chi Minh has high hopes for President Roosevelt's anti-imperial discourse. Ho pledges the Viet Minh to the Allied powers and tries to contact US intelligence in China. At first, though, there's little cooperation until Japan overthrows the Vichy French in March 1945 and arrests French troops. The US sends an Office of Strategic Services team to Vietnam in July 1945, which trains and arms the Viet Minh, but Japan's capitulation in August ends official support. Instead, Ho marches on Hanoi as the Viet Minh take control of Tonkin province. The Viet Minh are generally popular in the north, especially due to their efforts to distribute food in the 1944-45 famine, and Ho's revolution culminates in announcing Vietnamese independence on September 2nd. US OSS agents are at the ceremony and even salute the Viet Minh flag. OSS representative Archimedes Paddy even becomes a local celebrity. Paddy himself is impressed with Ho. On the day of the Proclamation of Independence and right before being recalled from the mission, he sends a sober outlook for the future of Vietnam to his higher-ups. Ho Chi Minh impresses me as a sensible, well-balanced, politically minded individual. His demands are few and simple, namely limited independence, liberation from French rule, the right to live as free people in a family of nations, and lastly, the right to deal directly with the outside world. From what I've seen, these people mean business, and I'm afraid that the French will have to deal with them. For that matter, we will all have to deal with them. Although Roosevelt opposed the return of French colonial power after the war, his successor, President Truman, has other concerns. He's sympathetic to Vietnamese nationalism, but also wants a restored France as a reliable ally against the Soviet Union in Europe. Ho sends letters to Truman asking for recognition, but State Department officials prevent their delivery. Instead, the US announces it is not against French sovereignty in Indochina, but will not intervene to restore it. The US does participate in the post-war division of Vietnam into two zones. Despite the ongoing Chinese Civil War, nationalist China is to occupy the north and the British the south. Meanwhile, Ho's provisional government spreads its influence, though the Chinese occupation, which includes widespread looting, limits his power base in Tonkin. Meanwhile, the Vietnamese set up a Southern Viet Minh Committee in Saigon, the political and economic center of the southern Annam province. But the Viet Minh is weaker inside Saigon and rushes to establish its presence before British troops arrive. Luckily for them, US General Douglas MacArthur delays the British arrival until after he accepts the Japanese surrender, meaning they arrive a week late on September 11th. This gives the Viet Minh time to establish a small power base, but the British force, mostly Indian troops, lands alongside French troops, including Free French commandos. Although there's some internal disagreement, Britain has decided to support French control. Britain is concerned about anti-colonialism spreading to their own colonies occupied by Japan during the war. A restored French Indochina, on the other hand, can trade with British colonies and solidify France as a powerful ally. The potential threat to Australia, New Zealand, India, Burma, Malaya, and the East Indies archipelago, resulting from Indochina being in the hands of a weak or unfriendly power, has been sufficiently demonstrated by the action of Japan in the Second World War. To oversee the transition, codenamed Operation Masterdom, Britain sends Major General Douglas Gracey. His orders are specific: accept the Japanese surrender, process Japanese soldiers, and repatriate French prisoners. He is to avoid internal politics and not acknowledge Ho's government. When he arrives, he ignores a Vietnamese welcome delegation and later speaks of his distrust. I went out there after the war and saw the French after they'd been through a most uncomfortable time with the Japanese. I was welcomed on arrival by the Viet Minh, who said welcome and all that sort of thing. It was a very unpleasant situation, and I promptly kicked them out. They are obviously communists. When Gracey arrives, Saigon has no functional government. Rioting and looting is common, including by French former prisoners, as well as Vietnamese militant religious sects and other political groups. Although Ho Chi Minh calls for no violence, the Viet Minh conducts targeted killings of political enemies, including those who collaborated with French and Japanese. Still armed Japanese guards provide little security, while French residents demand Gracey restore their position. Gracey generally sides with the French, though he encourages them to soften their rule. But he only has 1,300 troops to process 70,000 Japanese soldiers. Security concerns in Saigon means that he arms French prisoners and brings Japanese guards into a scratch security force. British reinforcements are on the way, but will take weeks to arrive in full. Gracie's actions clash with his own superior, Lord Louis Mountbatten, as well as US OSS representative Peter Dewey, who's much more critical of a French return, so Gracie declares Dewey persona non grata. On September 21, 1945, Gracie decrees new rules for Saigon, extending a nighttime curfew, banning public demonstrations and the unauthorized carrying of arms. Vietnamese groups complain the rules unfairly target them and accuse Gracie of pro-French bias. The Viet Minh responds with a general strike, which Gracie fears is just a prelude to an attack. Some Vietnamese groups, especially the Trotskyists, are planning one, but the Viet Minh mostly wants negotiations. On September 23rd, Gracie supports a French coup in Saigon, arming 1,400 French POWs who seize key buildings. In the struggle, 2 Frenchmen are killed and many Vietnamese civilians beaten. In retaliation, a group of Vietnamese, likely Trotskyists, attack a French residential district the next day, killing over 200, including women and children. Gracie arms more French prisoners, and by September 24th, general street fighting breaks out. Ho Chi Minh is distressed by events, but publicly supports the uprising, as does the Southern Viet Minh Committee. Grab weapons and rise up to force out the invading forces. Wipe out the French bandits, wipe out their collaborators. At first, the Viet Minh isolate Saigon and fight conventionally. They also try to seize key transport nodes like the Bin Loi Bridge. However, British Indian troops repel the attacks and bring in supplies via river barges. The Viet Minh launch attacks inside the city, and one of their ambushes kills Peter Dewey. The Viet Minh claim their men mistook his unmarked jeep for a French vehicle, and Dewey is the first American killed in Vietnam. British Indian troops relieve Saigon by September 28th, but the small force is exhausted, so Gracie turns to the Japanese for help. But Japanese allegiance is ambiguous, and some soldiers prefer to remain in Indochina than be repatriated to Japan. After interviewing Japanese veterans, historian Kiichi Tachikawa outlined their reasons. First, support for the independence movement. Second, avoiding war crime prosecution. Third, some had the chance to meet local people and became convinced to stay. Rumors spoke of Japan having turned into a burnt field, that if they returned, there would be nothing to eat. Some of these stay-behinds go on to cooperate with Viet Minh groups, including training and directing operations. Gracie notes the Japanese commander is angry at his troops' behavior, but has little control. Even so, Japanese troops become instrumental in British operations, including rescuing French prisoners from Viet Minh troops in Saigon. From October 1st to 10th, there's a ceasefire, which ends when the Viet Minh ambush a British Indian patrol. The brief pause is enough to bring in professional French troops under General Leclerc. British Indian troops stop attacks on Saigon's airport on October 12th, and with Saigon mostly secure, the British-French-Japanese force goes on the offensive. The objective is to secure the Triangle, an area between 3 towns northeast of Saigon. In this zone, Japanese troops can be concentrated, disarmed, and processed, but Viet Minh troops control the Triangle. From October 23rd to 25th, the British 100th Brigade clear out the 3 towns of Viet Minh and start processing Japanese prisoners. On October 24th, French troops secure towns in Saigon's southwest, while British troops burn down much of Saigon's commercial district in anti-Viet Minh operations. On October 29th, British-led forces in the Triangle are reformed into Gate Force, an armoured car column now including 500 Japanese infantrymen. It moves east to preempt Viet Minh attacks. Another British force, Clarkall, in conjunction with French troops, heads northwest, while French armour moves into the Mekong Delta. At Xuan Loc, Gate Force encounters Viet Minh troops in a rubber plantation. The British use armoured cars, while the Japanese launch a banzai attack at night. The Viet Minh conduct a banzai-style attack of their own, and the 2 forces clash in hand-to-hand combat. 250 Viet Minh and 1 Brit are killed, but the British do not record Japanese losses. The battle at Xuan Loc destroys the Viet Minh in that region. By November, Viet Minh resistance is crumbling under heavy losses, and the British accelerate processing Japanese troops. They hand over security to the French, who struggle against the resurgent Viet Minh in the Central Highlands. Gracie accepts the Japanese surrender on November 30th, and by late December, British troops start leaving Indochina. In early 1946, the British feel they've restored French sovereignty in Vietnam. They had not expected such resistance, and opposition at home and abroad is growing. Some in Britain's leftist Labour government question why Britain was assisting a French colonial adventure, and even some British officers criticized French behavior in Indochina. They really were a band of pretty unruly cutthroats. Their method of pacifying a village without any provocation was to drive through in American 3-ton trucks, 30 caliber machine guns on the cab, all guns firing on alternate sides of the street at first floor level. They seldom hit anyone, but if that is the way friends arrive, it is little wonder that the Vietnamese threw them out. Gracie also complains to Leclerc about French racism towards the British Indian troops, while Indian nationalists question why they're there at all. Indians watched with growing anger, shame, and helplessness that Indian troops should be used for doing Britain's dirty work against our friends, who are fighting the same fight as we. Britain wants out of Indochina and hopes the US will step in to support France. Gracie takes much of the blame, but his supporters claim he followed orders and made the best of a bad situation. In hindsight, some have questioned why Britain did so well against the Viet Minh in 1945, while the more powerful French and US forces later struggled. Firstly, the Viet Minh were nowhere near as sophisticated in the 1940s as they became in the 1950s or later as the Viet Cong. There was internal division between Northerners and Southerners, and the Viet Minh was only one of several groups competing in Saigon. Commanders had very limited control of their troops, and there was little overarching strategy. Key figures like Ho Chi Minh and Pho Nguyen Giap remained in the north. The Viet Minh also stuck to conventional tactics, only turning to guerrilla methods once they lost Saigon. But even here they lacked experience or equipment. Few knew how to maintain a machine gun, and some even carried bows or bamboo spears. British Indian and Gurkha troops, on the other hand, had lots of experience fighting in Burma or from occupation duties on the violent northwestern Indian frontier. British commanders attacked with caution, keeping open a line of retreat. Despite the disobedience of some, Japanese troops also contributed greatly and did not oppose the British in an organized manner. Importantly, British goals in Vietnam were extremely limited, handing over control to the French and processing Japanese troops. It was clear when these objectives were achieved, and there was no need to pacify the entire country or even all of Saigon. The Vietnamese people, especially in the south, were also hesitant to support a new war. Some, including Ho Chi Minh, still hoped France would negotiate a liberal policy and roadmap to independence. But these hopes are uncertain. In the north, the Chinese Civil War causes Chinese nationalists to change their policy and allow the French to return if they enter into talks with Ho. For now, the future of Indochina might be decided at the negotiation table, but that option won't last long. In March 1946, the French government demands to take over occupation duties in the north. The Chinese occupation forces are unpopular in northern Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh agrees to a deal. He will withdraw his 15,000 Viet Minh troops from Hanoi in exchange for recognition for his republic and a referendum on Indochina's future. Soon after, France recognizes Ho's Vietnamese Republic, but only as a free state within the new French Union, a single political entity incorporating the colonies. This is not the independence that the Viet Minh want, and Ho reassures his supporters that he has not abandoned the cause. You know that I, Ho Chi Minh, have always led you on the path to freedom, and that I have struggled all my life for the independence of our country. You know that I would rather die than betray our country. I swear to you that I have not sold it. French forces occupy Hanoi and even take some fire from local Chinese units. They re-establish their authority, but are slow to introduce the promised reforms and referendum. One major opponent to the deal is French High Commissioner Admiral Georges-Thierry d'Argentlieu. He's an ultra-conservative who opposes negotiation with Ho and believes that military power alone can control the Viet Minh. His military commander, General Philippe Leclerc, is not so sure. He believes the situation needs a political, not a military solution, and says to the government in Paris, France is no longer in a position to control by arms an entity of 24 million people, amongst whom xenophobia and perhaps even nationalism have taken root. The differences between Leclerc and d'Argentlieu mirror divisions in French domestic politics. The Fourth Republic is built on shaky foundations as an uneasy coalition of communist, socialist, and Christian conservative parties share power. For many, the Indo-Chinese question is simply an inconvenience. The priorities for many French politicians following the Second World War are economic recovery, political stability, and European security, not the crisis in Indochina. Although the socialist and communist parties are ideologically opposed to colonialism, they often downplay these beliefs in the interest of stability with the conservatives. They also had limited influence in Indochina. During Charles de Gaulle's time as chairman for the Provisional French government from 1944 to 46, he replaces many Vichy colonial administrators with his own inexperienced appointees. Dargentlieu and much of his staff are Gaullist appointees, and they're instructed to restore Indochina as a French colonial possession, partly as a means of rebuilding France's global reputation. Even after de Gaulle resigns as leader, Dargentlieu continues to favor his instructions and sometimes frustrated negotiation efforts. He expects de Gaulle will soon return to power in France and doesn't want to give away an inch of French sovereignty. I can assure you that if General de Gaulle were still Prime Minister of France, Ho Chi Minh would not get away with such impertinence. He would be obliged to keep his place. Dargentlieu adds to tensions when he states the former agreement with Ho does not apply to the southern province of Cochin China. Instead, he announces the creation of an autonomous Cochin Chinese Republic in southern Vietnam under former Emperor Bao Dai, who had also led the previous Japanese puppet regime in Vietnam. Once again, Bao Dai's authority exists more on paper than in practice. Dargentlieu's combative nature, as well as increasing Viet Minh dissatisfaction with the deal, leads to more violence. In November 1946, fighting breaks out in Haiphong, so the French bombard the port. Some claims suggest up to 6,000 civilians are killed. Both sides now scramble for fresh negotiations. French diplomat Jean Saint-Denis is impressed by Ho and believes a long-term solution is possible. But his critics say that he's naive to trust Ho Chi Minh and has fallen for a carefully curated false image of political moderation. In reality, they claim, Ho Chi Minh is a radical revolutionary communist preparing for war. In November and December 1946, final negotiations fail, and Ho writes to Saint-Denis, "Dear friend, I've just learned that you're going to return to France. I am certain, like myself, you deeply regret that our joint endeavor for peace was ruined by this fratricidal war. I know well enough to say to you that you are not responsible for this politics of strength and conquest. That is why I want to tell you again that despite what has happened, you and I remain friends. And I can affirm to you that our two peoples also remain friends. There is already enough death and ruin." On December 19, 1946, Vietnamese militia groups attacked the French in Hanoi, resulting in a strong French response. Some historians think the Viet Minh were not heavily involved in these attacks, and the event may have taken Ho Chi Minh himself by surprise. But in any case, the Indochina War has begun. By 1947, French forces, including armor, aircraft, paratroopers, colonial troops, and the French Foreign Legion, are arriving in increasing numbers. Both sides are largely equipped with World War II-era weapons, including captured equipment. The French initially operated locally sourced Japanese tanks like the Type 89 and 95, and recaptured pre- and early war French tanks. Eventually, US equipment from French armies in Europe arrives, including M4 Shermans, M24 Chaffee tanks, M3 half-tracks, and amphibious vehicles. With these forces, they eject the Viet Minh from the Red River Delta and occupy border towns. Lacking weapons and resources, the Viet Minh return to guerrilla warfare. For the next 2 years, they conduct an insurgency across Indochina. Most operations are confined to the north, especially the border region with China. However, attacks also take place closer to Saigon. Trong Ngo Tang, then a young revolutionary, recalls an ambush in the Mekong Delta. Just beyond the bend in the river, the guerrillas set obstacles made of logs and branches bound together and camouflaged with thick bunches of aquatic plants. At the expected time, the French appeared, maybe a dozen boats altogether, carrying nearly 400 soldiers. As they reached the barrier, the guerrillas, hiding on either side of the river, opened fire. Downstream, others pushed the escape barriers into place, trapping the flotilla. Caught in a deadly crossfire and unable to move, many of the French were simply mowed down. Such attacks lead to further French operations in the south to clear out the Viet Minh. Despite recalling d'Argentlieu in 1947, the French expand his plan for creating a separate Vietnamese state under Bao Dai. In March 1949, Bao Dai is announced as the leader of a unified state of Vietnam based in Saigon. This is really a French attempt to develop a political alternative to Ho's Vietnamese Republic in the north. But Bao Dai's collaboration with both Japanese and French regimes, as well as his lack of confidence, means that few Vietnamese nationalists support him. As the Viet Minh abandon urban areas for the jungles and rivers, Minister for Overseas France Paul Coste-Fleuret predicts victory. There is no longer a military problem in Indochina. No French garrison is surrounded. All the roads are clear. All the towns of any size are under our control. The situation, though, is not as rosy as Coste-Fleuret believes. The US refuses to recognize Bao Dai's state, and the Viet Minh remain a threat. In fact, they control around 55% of villages, and French logistical routes are already stretched thin. And Viet Minh fortunes soon change. In 1949, the Chinese Civil War results in a communist victory. Almost immediately, the Chinese Communist Party contacts the Viet Minh, and initially, they seem to have much in common. Both groups have their roots in the rural population, and helping Ho Chi Minh will shore up China's southern border. By 1950, Chinese advisors and weapons are moving into Tonkin to boost the growing regular Viet Minh forces. French Chief of the General Staff Georges Revert recommends abandoning frontier positions to safer ones in the Red River Delta, but Paris overrules him. Instead, he's ordered to hold the Cao Bang Lang Song Ridge. Consisting of hilltop sandbag forts, the French frontier positions sit along the Colonial Route No. 4, a vital French logistical route. The Viet Minh attacks these positions sporadically as early as 1947, but in late September 1950, Viet Minh assaults are more sophisticated. All along the ridge and the important town of Dong He, French defenders come under mortar fire and assault from 16,000 Viet Minh troops. Dong He falls after 2 days of bitter fighting, but the Viet Minh have their eyes on a different prize. Soon after the assaults, the French send a column from the Red River Delta to relieve the forts. Meanwhile, on October 3rd, French troops fall back from the forts, hoping to join up with the relief units. Now outside their fortified positions, the French are vulnerable to Viet Minh ambush. Despite French air support, Viet Minh units surround 8 French battalions and rapidly overwhelm them. The two French columns never meet, and the disaster costs up to 4,000 French deaths. By October 17th, all the French border positions have fallen, and the Red River Delta area seems under threat. The French dispatch a new High Commissioner, Général Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, with orders to save the situation. De Lattre served with the Free French in World War II and fought beside US troops in the invasion of southern France and Germany. Under his more competent leadership, the French strengthened the Delta positions and introduced US methods of air support that they witnessed during World War II. French troops are ordered not to abandon their positions, but fight to the last on the so-called Lattre Line. Meanwhile, Viet Minh commander Gia is encouraged by his success to go on the offensive. His Chinese advisors recommend human wave attacks along the French line throughout 1951. Such tactics, which draw on the Viet Minh's superiority in manpower, had worked to great effect in China against poorly armed nationalist troops, but in Vietnam, they wither away under French firepower. Artillery and airstrikes, including with napalm, break up Viet Minh assaults with heavy losses. In one attack on Vinh Yen, De Lattre personally oversees the defense, killing 6,000 Viet Minh troops with only 43 French dead. So in 1951, French military power seems to be containing the situation. What's more, the Korean War's outbreak limits Chinese support to the Viet Minh. De Lattre now senses that the time is right to expand operations and seek international assistance, but problems remain. First, De Lattre receives only mild support from Paris. The Indo-Chinese War is of little interest in the country, and the fact that the war is undeclared means that almost all French European soldiers are volunteers. As a result, they only make up half of the overall French force, although they do the bulk of the fighting. Well as French volunteers, Germans, Hungarians, Yugoslavs, and Spanish make up significant parts of the Foreign Legion. However, rumors that much of the Legion are ex-SS men are likely exaggerated. The remainder of the force is colonial troops and local Vietnamese, especially those from ethnic and religious minorities. By 1953, 160,000 Vietnamese would serve with the French forces. Studies later showed that mixed French-Vietnamese units often outperformed solely European units, partly thanks to the Vietnamese troops' local knowledge. In 1950, de Lattre uses these newly raised troops to free up French legionnaires and paratroopers for offensive operations. He conducts a series of sweeping maneuvers across Tonkin, targeting Viet Minh training bases, depots, and propaganda centers. As the French try to seize the initiative, Jia falls back on his guerrilla methods. 3 months of failed assaults have used up his regular trained units, and with Chinese support dropping, Jia accepts the Indo-Chinese War will be a long struggle. De Lattre has come to a similar conclusion and now looks for international support for his campaign. Initially, France wanted to keep the US out of Indochina, but with conflicts developing in Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, de Lattre needs both financial and military support that metropolitan France can't provide. To do this, he rebrands the conflict as a defensive struggle against international communism. This seems to get some traction in the United States, which is experiencing heightened Cold War tensions and fears of communism. In early 1950, the US agrees to recognize Bao Dai's puppet government and provide military and economic aid. However, with American efforts focused on Korea, US help is mostly limited to a $10 million aid package and a few military advisors. When de Lattre suddenly dies of cancer, the French lose their most effective advocate for US intervention, and US President Truman maintains some distance. Supporting the French in Indochina is still burdened with colonial overtones that many Americans find uncomfortable, like future President John F. Kennedy. In Indochina, we have allied ourselves to the desperate effort of a French regime to hang on to the remnants of empire. Meanwhile, in northern Vietnam, the Viet Minh continue to avoid battle. Instead, Jia is all too happy to allow the French to overextend themselves in hostile territory. In late October 1952, French forces launch Operation Lorraine, the largest sweep to date. French troops enter Viet Minh territory and capture supply depots nearly 160 kilometers from the Delta defenses. Assisted by paratrooper drops, French forces capture Phu Doan on November 9th against light resistance. French mobile groups then link up and fan out towards other targets. That's when the Viet Minh strike. On November 14th, they ambush French columns in a narrow gorge near Chan Muang. French troops fall back to the Delta defenses with heavy losses, especially amongst the paratroopers. By the time the stragglers cross the Lattre line, the French lose 1,200 men. Operation Lorraine almost ends in a repeat of the Cao Bang disaster of 1950. And just like after that battle, Jia and the Viet Minh are filled with confidence and a desire to step up operations. The isolated French outpost of Nha San seems like an ideal opportunity to strike another blow at France. In November 1952, Nha San is home to a French garrison, firebase, and airstrip. Protected by 15,000 troops, 105mm howitzers, and aircraft, Nha San is a particularly well-defended position, capable of resupply by air. Its commander, General Jean Gilles, employs hérisson or hedgehog tactics to defend the camp, surrounding the central position with 30 armed points forming an inner and outer ring. Many are reinforced with barbed wire and are positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Nha San has been purposefully developed to draw the Viet Minh into costly attacks. On November 23rd, Jia opens his assault on the camp by attacking Point 8. However, French artillery and air power drive back 2 Vietnamese attacks. Jia then employs night infiltration techniques, but the French stop these too. A week later, fresh Viet Minh assaults target the more isolated points 22B and 24. Both positions hold out for several hours before the Viet Minh overrun them. But Viet Minh losses are so high they cannot capitalize on the success. The next day, concentrated French artillery and airstrikes against their positions drive them back. Jia launches a final general assault during the night of December 1st, especially against points 21B and 26. The French defenders use flares for illumination and again call in close-range artillery and air power, beating the Viet Minh back. With losses mounting, Jia calls off the attack. Once again, it seems he's been too quick to try large-scale conventional operations, at the cost of around 1,500 Viet Minh killed and up to 6,000 wounded. For the French, despite their heavy losses of around 500 men, it appears they've found a winning formula. Both Viet Minh and Nha San have shown the potency of French air and artillery power and their ability to defeat Viet Minh attacks with low casualties. If the French can establish positions behind enemy lines and resupply them by air, so-called airheads, the Viet Minh could be forced into costly attacks that can be followed up with French offensive operations to finally defeat the Viet Minh. As French planners scour their maps for the location of their next ambitious airhead, they finally choose the small, isolated village of Dien Bien Phu. By early 1953, the Indochina War is a stalemate. Both sides, the Viet Minh and French Union, have experienced their fair share of victories and defeats. Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Gia's Viet Minh forces wiped out the French border forts and garrisons in 1950 and ambushed a major French patrol in 1952. But they've been unable to capture significant French positions defended by artillery and air power. In their attacks on Vinh Yen in 1951 and Nha San in 1952, they suffer huge casualties for no gain. Meanwhile, French Union troops have been able to hold the Red River Delta, but are unable to pursue Viet Minh forces and destroy them on their terms. To solve the problem, Paris sends General Henri Navarre to Indochina in May 1953. He's been instructed to find an honorable way out of the war, but to do this, he needs victories on the battlefield to gain a diplomatic advantage. He knows that his paratrooper and Foreign Legion forces are vital to offensive operations, but their manpower is being used up defending almost 900 garrisons all across Indochina. So Navarre decides to abandon many remote garrisons, including Nha San, and consolidate forces in the Red River Delta in anticipation of a future offensive. In central and southern Vietnam, commando-style raids will mop up isolated Viet Minh groups, but elsewhere he focuses on training up local Vietnamese forces. Once they can take over garrison duties, French troops will be freed up for mobile operations. He also asked the United States for more help. In the US, former World War II Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower is now in the White House. He's concerned about communism's spread in Europe and is fearful of a similar fate in Asia. In July 1953, the Korean War ends in a stalemate and the peninsula's division. On one hand, the Korean War showed the ability of international forces to stem the tide of communism, but on the other, it came at a huge cost and with no definitive victory. The Korea experience also shifts US attitudes towards Ho Chi Minh. Previously, Truman's administration had been sympathetic to Vietnamese independence movements opposing French colonialism. An American OSS team had even trained and supplied Ho Chi Minh and Pho Nguyen Gia in August 1945 to fight the Japanese who were then occupying Indochina. However, Eisenhower's administration now sees the hand of monolithic Soviet communism behind the Viet Minh movement. The US agrees to bankroll Navarre's plan with a $400 million aid package, but only on the condition that France abandons planned negotiations with Ho Chi Minh and accepts West German remilitarization in Europe. Soon, Viet Minh movements force a French response, since the revolutionaries are extending operations into Laos. Such a move would extend the war beyond the range of French mobile groups based in the Red River Delta, making future French operations much harder. Navarre decides to interrupt the Viet Minh supply routes into Laos by seizing the strategically important village of Dien Bien Phu in an airborne attack. On November 20th, 1953, 6 French parachute battalions drop into the area. They encounter light resistance, although even this is more than what they anticipated. Major Bijard of the 6th Colonial Parachute Battalion recalled. When we came down on November 20th, we were told there would be no Vietnamese. But there were 2 companies exactly where we jumped. Some of my men were killed before they even touched the ground. Others were stabbed where they landed. After the French secure the area, they paradrop bulldozers and other equipment to create a new airhead. The plan is for Dien Bien Phu to serve as a base for offensive raids and patrols into the Viet Minh rear areas. Much like at Nha San, it will be resupplied entirely by air via its 2 airstrips in the valley. In early 1954, French forces turned Dien Bien Phu into a fortified position with 9 defensive bastions, with an inner and outer ring. Most of these are on the flat valley floor next to the airstrips, although several are located on the hills above. The French fly in troops and equipment, including artillery, 10 M24 Chaffee tanks, and 9 Bearcat fighter bombers. To deliver the tanks, they break the vehicles down into multiple parts and reassemble them on site after delivery. They also bring in Vietnamese and Algerian women to work at the base brothel. A near constant stream of transports eventually deliver around 10,800 men to the camp by January, many of them colonial or French allied Vietnamese troops. Colonel Charles Pirotte, commander of artillery at Dien Bien Phu, insists that his guns will wipe out any Viet Minh artillery that might approach. No Viet Minh gun will fire 3 rounds without being destroyed. But the Dien Bien Phu position has some critical flaws, which are quickly recognized by the Viet Minh. It's 275 kilometers from Hanoi, much farther than Nha San. Both air supply and support will be slower to arrive, while it's also out of the range of ground-based French mobile troops. Since it's been developed as an offensively oriented camp, its defenses are also not as prepared as at Nha San. There are large gaps between bastions, some of which are isolated and far from headquarters. The French artillery at Dien Bien Phu is poorly protected, and with only 60 guns, is not proportional to the size of the camp. Perhaps most important of all, much of the camp, including the vital airstrip, is overlooked by forested hills. The French know about these vulnerabilities, but don't consider them critical. Locally based aircraft, including a handful of early helicopters, can provide constant air support, while the hills are generally considered impassable for heavy equipment. In any case, the Viet Minh have never shown much skill for artillery or anti-aircraft tactics. Isolated bastions will merely lure the Viet Minh in, where, much like at Nha San, the French can destroy them. Viet Minh military commander Vo Nguyen Gia moves 50,000 regular Viet Minh troops into the area, about 1/3 of his total regular force. Furthermore, with the Korean War over, the Viet Minh can count on more Chinese support. Viet Minh troops undergo training in artillery, heavy weapons, and engineering, and they're now equipped with large caliber artillery, including American models captured in Korea by the Chinese, and more sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons. The Central Military Committee of the Chinese Communist Party tells its advisors in Indochina, "To eliminate the enemy totally and to win the final victory in the campaign, you should use overwhelming artillery fire. Do not save artillery shells. We will supply and deliver sufficient shells to you." The French notice the build-up and attempt to bomb Viet Minh columns on roads and known jungle paths. However, an army of Vietnamese porters cut new hidden paths through the jungle, eventually totaling over 500 kilometers. By January, around 240 Viet Minh artillery pieces, heavy mortars, recoilless rifles, and flak guns have been maneuvered into the hills surrounding Dien Bien Phu. Such a concentration of manpower and equipment is a gamble for Gia, as it leaves other areas undefended and could result in the loss of precious heavy weapons. However, negotiations are planned for April, and he knows that whoever wins at Dien Bien Phu will gain a diplomatic advantage. Gia's guns open fire on January 31st, 1954, and continue to fire from time to time for 6 weeks. The Vietnamese gunners are ranging their guns and observing French counter-battery fire. By March, the valley is a moonscape and the French await the coming assault. War reporter André Lebon recorded a conversation between 2 French troopers. "It's going to be like Nha San, only 10 times bigger. Or almost Verdun. This time they'll put all their big artillery here and will show us what they've learned about big war fighting." On March 11th, the 1st Viet Minh probing attacks target the northern Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, and Béatrice bastions. Isolated on a hilltop, Béatrice is especially exposed. Viet Minh assaults show more sophistication than at Nha San. Before an attack, they pound French positions with accurate artillery, collapsing bunkers and knocking out guns. A legionnaire at Béatrice recalls the barrage. "We are all surprised and ask ourselves how the Viets have been able to find so many guns capable of producing an artillery fire of such power. Shells rain down on us without stopping, like a hailstorm on a fall evening. Bunker after bunker, trench after trench collapsed, burying under them men and weapons." Viet Minh diversionary attacks prevent the French from sending help, and Béatrice is overrun on March 14th with 75% French casualties. Next, Gia targets Gabriel, and despite a French armored counterattack, that position also falls. French counter-battery fire is ineffective and fires 25% of their ammunition on the first day. As resupply aircraft attempt to land, they encounter a hail of anti-aircraft fire from the surrounding hills. Meanwhile, artillery hits the runway as well. Vietnamese shells destroy C-47 transport planes on the ground and damage all but 2 of the Bearcats. On March 15th, with much of the French artillery destroyed or ineffective, Colonel Pirot apologizes to his officers before killing himself with a grenade. To many, the battle already seems lost, but the remaining French troops fight on and reinforcements are dropped into the camp. Up to 4,300 French troops, some with no parachute experience, will be dropped into Dien Bien Phu from mid-March to early May. In early April, French paratrooper Captain Pierre Fauroux jumped into Dien Bien Phu at night. I jumped with the first wave close to midnight. No sooner did my parachute open than I found myself in the middle of an extraordinary spectacle. Anti-aircraft fire, illumination flares, tracer rounds. It was a real Bastille Day fireworks show. French nurses are often on board return flights to care for the wounded, and one, Geneviève de Galard, ends up staying on the base throughout the entire siege to care for the wounded, earning her the Légion d'honneur. The French troops now reinforce the main camp while their leaders discuss 3 ways out of the developing disaster. Operation Condor would see a relief column march on Dien Bien Phu. Operation Albatross would be a garrison breakout towards the French positions. Or Operation Vulture, which would be a request to the US military for more support. The French decide to pursue both Condor and Vulture with Albatross held in reserve. However, it's extremely difficult to gather the transport and troops needed for Condor, and commanders are skeptical. Instead, Navarre focuses on Vulture. He asks the US to lend France heavy B-29 bombers, which can blow away Viet Minh artillery and anti-aircraft positions. Officially, the B-29s will be flown by French crews, but given the training difficulties, it's debatable how likely this is. The Americans understand that the French are asking for direct US military involvement. The request does have supporters in Washington. Secretary of State John Dulles and Vice President Richard Nixon support armed intervention, perhaps even the use of atomic bombs. But others aren't so keen. By 1954, the US is already covering almost 80% of French military expenditure in Indochina, and General Matthew Ridgway, former commander in Korea, suggests further commitment will bog down resources and likely provoke Chinese intervention. He's joined by House Minority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson, who argues any intervention should be part of an international coalition, including Britain and other democratic Asian states. President Eisenhower writes British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to encourage a united front. If I may refer again to history, we failed to halt Hirohito, Mussolini, and Hitler by not acting in unity and in time. That marked the beginning of many years of stark tragedy and desperate peril. May it not be that our nations have learned something from that lesson? The letter gets a cool reception in Britain, where the public favors a negotiated settlement with the Viet Minh. There will be no international coalition, and consequently no official US intervention, although 37 American pilots fly 682 resupply sorties to Dien Bien Phu. They're officially employed by Civil Air Transport, an airline covertly operated by the CIA. Some historians suggest that Eisenhower knew his proposal would fail, but was looking for a way to avoid intervention while simultaneously appearing supportive of France. He later stated, "If the United States were unilaterally to permit its forces to be drawn into conflict in Indochina and in a succession of Asian wars, the end result would be to drain off our resources and to weaken our overall defensive position." So by late March, the besieged French defenders of Dien Bien Phu are on the verge of defeat. The Vietnamese have captured much of the northern camp and nearly put the airfield out of action. With no US support coming, the French prepare a relief column in Laos, although poor weather and Viet Minh activity will get in the way. Meanwhile, French air support is ineffective against the Viet Minh. With Dien Bien Phu's own planes destroyed, it must rely on air support from the Red River Delta. But heavy anti-aircraft fire means few planes remain in the area to properly spot and hit Viet Minh targets. As napalm supplies are used up, the French resort to dropping lazy dog cluster bombs, anti-personnel weapons consisting of 11,200 sharpened, finned flechettes which could penetrate jungle cover over a wide area with deadly effect. Undeterred, the Viet Minh continue their assault. On March 30th, they target bastions Dominique 1 and 2, as well as Hélène 1, 2, and 4 in the so-called Battle of the Five Hills. Despite some French success with quad-mounted 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns used in a ground role, they lose parts of Dominique and Hélène in heavy fighting. The French do launch some successful counterattacks, but in reality, these just weaken the remaining units. With casualties among legionnaires and paratroopers growing, the defense increasingly falls to French allied Vietnamese, Algerian, and Moroccan auxiliary units. With fighting raging in the east, the Viet Minh attack the west of the headquarters, targeting bastions Françoise and Huguette. Viet Minh casualties are very heavy, and Jia admits the fighting for Huguette is testing his soldiers' nerve. The principal trait of that phase of the battle has been the violent character of the combat. The battle having lasted a very long time, more troops, who had to fight without interruption, became fatigued and are worn and are faced with great nervous tension. Our forces have not been able to avoid decimation, which requires rapid reorganization and reinforcement. To avoid a collapse in morale, Jia resorts to siege tactics to break the heavily fortified headquarters. Chinese engineers arrive, and Viet Minh troops dig sapping tunnels, assault trenches, and other siege works to close up to French positions. Since mid-April, the French only hold an area roughly 1.5 kilometers in diameter, and their supplies are running low. Transport planes attempt to paradrop more supplies, but many fall on Viet Minh positions. To make matters even worse for the French, since April 22nd, Viet Minh ambushes and monsoon rains have slowed the relief effort. By early May, the French defenders were under a hail of artillery fire in flooded trenches. Captain Foureux recalls. On the afternoon of May 6, Major Brechignac asked me to go with a radio operator toward the center of the fighting to look for a less pulverized place where we could reassemble the surviving elements of the battalion. I advanced through the trenches in mud up to my chest. The shells never ceased to fall. At a bend in the trench, I lost sight of the radio operator. He must have been killed by a shell and swallowed up by the mud. I realized then that the end was at hand. In the final assaults, a new Chinese weapon arrives on the battlefield. 6-barreled rocket launchers similar to the Second World War German Nebelwerfer. The Viet Minh used them for the last barrages on the headquarters positions, which comes under direct assault on May 7th. By 6 p.m., they've taken the main camp. Now, only the isolated French bastion of Isabelle holds out. Under full Viet Minh attack, the defense is hopeless. With one defender describing conditions as, quote, hell in a very small place, the French decide to break out to the south in multiple directions. Most, though, will be killed or captured, and only 78 French troops are able to escape from Dien Bien Phu. On May 8th, while France celebrates the 9th anniversary of the Allied victory over Germany, relief units confirm Dien Bien Phu's fall with a single code word: Austerlitz. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu is a disaster for the French colonial authorities. 2,300 French troops are killed, 6,400 wounded, and 9,000 captured. Viet Minh casualties may be as high as 30,000, but Ho Chi Minh secures an important victory on the eve of the negotiations. Despite significant French and Allied military personnel remaining in Indochina, Dien Bien Phu signals the end of the French will to fight. The war is already unpopular or even irrelevant in metropolitan France. A May 1953 survey reports that only 23% of French respondents took an active interest in what was now termed la sale guerre, the dirty war. The First Indochina War would cost the lives of almost 79,000 French Union troops, including 15,000 North Africans. Up to 200,000 Viet Minh may have also been killed. At the Geneva Accords in July 1954, the US, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China strike a deal. Laos and Cambodia become independent kingdoms, and Vietnam is divided into 2 states along the 17th parallel. A northern communist state under Ho Chi Minh, and a southern non-communist one led by Bao Dai and his Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem. In exchange, the Viet Minh withdraw all units to the north in anticipation of Vietnam-wide elections in 1956. The now independent Republic of Vietnam in the south expels French administrators and troops in favor of American support. For Ho Chi Minh and his supporters, the deal is not a good one. They'd long fought for a unified Vietnamese state, however the Chinese pressure them to compromise. China has achieved its national security goals of creating a secure frontier and preventing US military intervention. Creating a unified and powerful independent Vietnamese communist state with a strong nationalist ideology might not actually be beneficial to Chinese regional aspirations, especially given historical tensions between Chinese and Vietnamese states. Instead, China hopes to pursue a peace offensive in the coming years to legitimate its state and shore up its diplomatic and strategic gains. For Viet Minh leader Le Duan, it's a bitter pill to swallow. I traveled by wagon to the south. Along the way, compatriots came out to greet me, for they thought we'd won a victory. It was so painful. For the US, a North Vietnamese communist state is cause for alarm. Soon, Eisenhower is talking of other Asian states potentially succumbing to communism like falling dominoes. American leaders now discuss protecting South Vietnam from its communist neighbor, and with the French out of the picture, they feel they can do so without the taint of colonialism. So in 1954, Indochina's struggles, especially Vietnam's, are far from over. The Indochina War was just one of many Cold War conflicts that emerged from the end of the Second World War. Around the world, many colonies attempted to gain independence and work with the new balance of power between the United States and the West and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was also in a technological competition with their enemies to acquire nuclear weapons and harness the power of nuclear energy. Before his death, Joseph Stalin dreamed of nuclear-powered communism. If you want to learn more about the Soviet nuclear program from its roots in the interwar years to the Chernobyl disaster and beyond, check out our documentary series Red Atoms, which is available exclusively on Nebula, a streaming service we're building together with other creators and where we don't have to worry about YouTube's advertising guidelines and the almighty algorithm. If you go to nebula.tv/realtimehistory, you can sign up for just $30 for an entire year and watch all our content there in 4K, ad-free, and earlier than on YouTube. Plus, exclusive documentaries like Red Atoms, our World War II series 16 Days in Berlin, or Rhineland 45, as well as other creators like Mustard or Real Engineering. And for those of you that want to share everything Nebula has to offer with your family and friends, Nebula is now offering annual gift cards. Visit gift.nebula.tv/realtimehistory to give a year of Nebula to a friend for just $30. Whichever option you choose, signing up directly or gifting a year of Nebula to somebody else will also support this channel. As usual, you can find all the sources for this episode in the video description below. If you want to learn more about the fate of Vietnam after the Indochina War, check out our series on the Vietnam War, or Second Indochina War as it's sometimes called. If you're watching this video on Nebula or Patreon, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that would never underestimate Vietnam.